Peace, family. It's your brother Marc Lamont Hill. I am so excited to be here with you all today. We have so much going on. And of course, I want to welcome you to Office Hours, where we break down everything going on in the world. You know, Monday to Friday at 9 p.m., we do night school, where we have a kind of deep dive analysis of all the issues and debates and topics that are going on in the world. But every Sunday night, we do night school, where I get to have a deep dive conversation with a single person or people who are at the cutting edge of thinking about the issues going on in our world, who have their own body of work worth investigating and thinking through, and who can help us not just understand the world, but also leave the world better than we found it. And so tonight, and I gave you a little sneak peek, we're joined by somebody, Dr. Tricia Rose, who will help us understand a whole bunch of the racial discourse that has been going on in these United States. Let me first of all, Tricia, good to see you.
It's great to see you, Marc. You holding it down, bro. You know, you got ways to communicate, helping us out every day. 7 days a week.
I'm trying. Well, I needed help today though, because you know, a week ago, or maybe it's been 2 weeks now, since Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris announced, or it was announced that she would be most likely assuming the top part of the ticket, being the Democratic Party's nominee for president. There's been a lot of debate, a lot of conversation. One of the conversations is she progressive enough? Is she radical enough? Is she a moderate? Is she a liberal? And we can talk about that. But what seemed more fascinating and troubling to me is that now suddenly, there's also a conversation about whether or not this woman is even Black.
Right, exactly.
What? I didn't even know that was a thing that people were debating. So
I know, exactly. I mean, well, actually, is she Black enough? It's like it's both Black and Black enough.
Right. So talk to me about the first of all, just the Black part, because I want to be clear, everybody. This isn't just a question of like the normal, like, are they Black enough, like Clarence Thomas, or you know, we used to make jokes about different people, but like people are legitimately questioning her racial makeup.
Right. Exactly. Well, I mean, look, this was only really Trump started this, right? This was not a part of the original framing, but this is a strategy to make people fearful, white people in particular, fearful and confused about what constitutes Blackness, right? I mean, we have created a society in which people are ignorant about race, right? They are forced to wonder things that we would otherwise know if we were educated in school about how these categories came into being, what the boundaries were, what the value of those boundaries were, why the one-drop rule was a phenomenon, and why that's not the same all over the world. Brazil has a different system for when they start deciding what group of race you're in, which is, you know, again, a biological fiction, but a deep social phenomenon. So what's happening here is, in my opinion, is that Trump is manipulating the fear underneath this question of race and who's different and what are the terms. And he's manipulating Black people's own concerns about people who may not have experienced the full range of African-American experience, might harbor a little bit of, you know, sort of, why do they always get ahead? These, you know, people who are mixed race, people who are closer to other groups of people as well. So he's manipulating both sides of this, I think, just to peel off just enough Black people and encourage just liberal whites who might be fearful to go in that direction.
You just made Donald Trump sound really sophisticated.
Oh, he's not doing it himself. Somebody.
Okay, I was gonna say, is he an idiot savant or is he like a puppet? I was trying to figure out how this was happening. I knew it wasn't him.
Yeah. No, I mean, to me, when I say look, first of all, he is very savvy about how to manipulate people, right? This isn't a strategy that, you know, you have to be a genius to come up with, but you do have to have a sense of, well, he's had a very good sense of where the soft spots are. And he's poking because he wasn't prepared for Kamala. But his agenda is to create separation, fear, confusion, to create and also to distract us in the wrong conversation. So here, for example, what are we talking about? Whether or not how much Black she is, what constitutes Blackness? Well, what exactly difference does that make? It actually makes no difference. What makes a difference is, can we talk about race in such a way that we can create more racial equity in society as a whole? And we don't need a Black female president to do that, right? That's just that, you know, we can have a president of various categories who could do that. But by creating a collapse between I'm this identity and therefore I have this political point of view, they actually diminish the whole systemic process by which inequality is created and maintained, because you have to get a representative of it, right? It's not something we're all invested in and we're all connected to. So it's a big fat distraction. Hey, Mark, I can't hear you actually.
That's because I hit the mute button. I'm a media professional, y'all.
Like, oh, my volume's up. I don't know where that brother went.
It's so fascinating because the other side isn't black. I could see if she were running against Tim Scott.
Okay.
And they were like, well, at least he's a real black. So, you have to, but she's running against a white man.
I know. But remember, now they created all these categories and boundaries in the first place. Right? They want to act like there's confusion. There's no confusion. They created them all. They created the one drop rule. They created the idea that if you're at all black, you're all black. They created a constant system of physical segregation based on, color and the racial ascription that would maintain a sense of full boundary between whiteness and blackness, even though, as we know, many whites have many racial backgrounds in their families, right? DNA is making that clear. But we have a social boundary that Trump and others are helping create reminders of separation and the so-called importance of that separation. She can't be black and Indian.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Donald Trump showed up to the National Association of Black Journalists conference this past week. That's a whole fiasco in and of itself. And he raised that very question when he was asked if Kamala Harris was a DEI hire. I want to play the clip and get your feedback.
Sir, do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much. And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She is always identified as a black woman.
I respect either one. I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that she is?
I think somebody should look into that.
I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but he's such an absurd person.
I mean, somebody should look into that. Look into what? Look into. But this
I don't know what that means.
I mean, look, when he says I respect either one, right? He is actually reinforcing racial categorization, right? He is reinforcing the notion that you can only be one racial group. And this is from the gentleman who has created the context in which race is not actually a category that we can use to determine various forms of access to various kinds of opportunity, like higher education and jobs. But we can identify races by clear definition, so much so that you cannot be more than one, right? And so this is obviously the fundamental contradiction, that they want to manipulate the erasure of Black experience as a discriminatory one and turn it into just a matter of personal identity. Right.
So we see race, we acknowledge it exists, but we will refuse to concede that it has any impact on how you move through the world, what resources you have access to, all of that.
Because when we keep it abstract like this, either one, tell us which one you are, that totally erases whiteness. It's a personal matter. It's no longer a relational matter, as in, wealth gap based on race, right? Which would tell us about white experiences, right? But we don't talk about that when we're in the realm of identity politics battle. Right? Because then what we're talking really about is race as a kind of personal experience, not a collective experience, not an experience that might have discriminatory outcomes based on what your background is. So it doesn't matter whether she says, for example, hey, I'm Indian, or I'm Black. She's still gonna have trouble getting a loan because she's Black.
Right.
That's the reality.
What do you? I've been seeing a lot of conversation online. I hear you about Donald Trump sort of sparking this. Is she even Black thing? Is she late to the Black train? Thing. And obviously there's some credible defenses to that. I mean, she went to Howard University. Right. She pledged AKA. She's been in Black spaces for a very long time. Right? She definitely didn't decide to be Black last week.
Exactly.
But there are people who are saying that she is sort of she's being very sort of not cagey, but she's being very strategic in how she talks about racial identity. I'm Indian. Yeah. What do you make of it?
Well, yes. I mean, how could you not be cagey? I mean, the world is creating an environment in which she can't say the truth. She can't actually say, look, both things are true. And, it's none of your business. Number one, right? I'm not running on a black campaign platform, right?
That's for sure.
So the question is, what are my policies? What are my practices? What do I want to imagine America to be? And my race influences my ideas, but it's my ideas that you need to be asking questions about. But that's not where a person who wants to undermine her would go, because she's taking a fairly accessible, democratic, liberal, vision. And so that is a kind of, hey, we're all in the same country together, and we're trying to share that in the best way we can. There's no real racial conflict in that framework. But I think the thing that is really problematic for me is that many Black folks, if they want to be well known in mainstream circles, they have to perform a particular kind of Blackness in order to even get registered. So she tells her story in a very personal way, and all of the people of color do of various types. I'm this group, I'm that group, I'm a combination of these groups, and I grew up with this experience. I had an Italian grandmother, and we ate Sunday dinners together, and somebody else had something else. And so this becomes the way that particularly Black people have to be understood through that liberal lens in order to be accepted. And, that's troubling. That is more troubling to me than anything she chooses to say. She should really not have to answer these questions at all. What difference does it make? It actually makes no difference.
I've heard some people on the internet, particularly the people who sort of identify as like ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery, and the FBA folk, and they're very different groups, and one that seems more legitimate than the other, but who are saying, like, what value is it to say that she's Black in this sort of broad globalist, global sense, when she's not of our lineage, that she's not of they would say slave stock, which is very troubling language to me, but she's not slave stock. She didn't go through what she went through. Her family and she's not part of a tradition of people who are harmed by the legacy of white supremacy in the same way. And therefore, when she says I'm Black, the world assumes that she's one of us. And for lack of a better word, she ain't like us.
Well, okay. So, I mean, look, Jamaica was a part of the transatlantic slave trade, right? So it is a different experience than the American South, but it is not a, happy-go-lucky free-for-all for people of African descent in the Caribbean in general, and certainly not in Jamaica. There's slavery, dramatic kinds of violence, but a different framework, right? And a majority Black population, which has a huge impact over time around how people understand the context for their oppression. Is my sense. I think there is nothing wrong with African Americans making sure that their distinctive experience is not erased in our conversation of global racial unity. That said, it is not productive to get into that conversation when basically these mild or even significant distinctions are being stoked for the sake of creating more white supremacy. Right. So if the point is to create more white supremacy, why would you want to get involved in that? Why would you want to make your case on the side of people who want to destroy democracy for everyone, who want to incarcerate Black people, for a very long time, and who deny that systemic racism even exists, and creating laws in which prevent you from even teaching it or talking about it? That to me feels like a much more urgent problem than deciding where an African American ends and an Afro-Caribbean begins.
So
what do you think about that, Mark? I mean, what's your feeling?
I'm inclined to agree. I think that there are legitimate ways that I used to dismiss the ADOS thing altogether, right? And because I saw it as xenophobic, I saw it as dangerous, all those things. Right. I do think as we talk about reparations that there is some value in identifying the particular lineage of folk who are descendants of slavery. It is a specific and unique justice claim that we have that needs to be identified, that is different from folk from other places. Right. And I think after several hundred years, there are particular cultural practices and traditions that have coalesced around this identity. And it is our identity, right, in a very specific way. But I don't ever want to embrace that identity at the expense of a global sense of solidarity against a global sense of African identity. And also, just quite frankly, white supremacy is not that nuanced at the level of deciding. The police don't decide whether I'm Caribbean or whether I'm from, they don't know about my stock when they pull me
South
over.
Carolina, right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're not making them distinctions. You know what I mean?
No.
And so I don't want to do that either. And so I that's where I get a little frustrated. And when it comes to Kamala Harris in particular, I'm watching people parse through her birth certificate and her dad's birth certificate, looking up pictures, questioning whether she was really Black or whether she's trying on Blackness. Like they're comparing her to Rachel Dolezal.
I mean, look, this is such a sickness. It's a sickness.
That's crazy.
And it's a manipulation of the process. See, look, all of this is a distraction, Mark.
Yeah.
This is a distraction from the suffering that Black people are facing every day. We still have the most profoundly unequal public schools. The funding levels are millions, and in some cases, billions of dollars better and higher for generally predominantly white communities and desperately underfunded in poor Black and brown communities. We still have tremendous job discrimination. We still have tremendous healthcare discrimination. We have hospitals that are completely at the bottom of the barrel in terms of quality of healthcare delivered, so much so that they're frequently called safety net hospitals, which is another way of saying, it's your last chance before you hit the ground. And so these are the things we want to talk about race so much. I got plenty to help people with, right? I mean, part of my argument in meta racism is that the network of forces and factors in health, in education, in policing, in schools, and housing are so profound and interactive and interlocking that they create a level of impact far greater than any one of those forms of discrimination could on their own. And
break it down for my audience for a minute. I want you to step back. First of all, when you say racism, because people have very different ideas of even what racism is and what it means. What is that? What do we mean when we say racism?
Right. Okay. So there are lots of different kinds of racism that we could be talking about. We could be talking about personal beliefs. We could be talking about unconscious bias, right? Where people hold negative beliefs about, say, Black people, but they aren't aware of it. We could be talking about policies, individual policies. We could be talking about institutions, or we could be talking about the biggest level, which is racism as a core organizing principle for a society. Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of pieces.
Are those just different definitions, or do you see one as having more legitimacy than another?
Well, it depends on what the problem is, right? I think that, they all have legitimacy and they actually work quite relationally, right? They're not like in separate worlds. But what I think is what worries me is that because we only focus on sort of racism as a personal behavior, right? You called me a name, you teased me at school, or the teacher was racist by, one comment here or there, right? Now we get caught up in those because they're visible, or we look at a cop doing something horrible and we get caught up in the visibility. And of course, it's a horrible thing, but the invisible is actually where we're getting choked to death. And the invisible is a network of policies and practices that create profound obstacles and headwinds. So let me give you an example. If we were to take, for example, Mike Brown, whose 10th anniversary is coming up fairly soon, and we think about, well, what was it that put him in harm's way? What was it that created the context in which Darren Wilson thought this was a reasonable way to respond to him? And all of the ways that Ferguson responded afterwards, and so on and so forth. Now, the way we talked about it, and I'd love to hear your take, but the way we talked about it generally was, a bad cop, and then Ferguson being sort of a corrupt town.
Right.
But if we actually dig in to what world that Michael Brown lived in and what his chances were, it is a system that made, Darren Wilson's activities actually pitifully small by comparison. When we think about, the schools he went to were never accredited his whole life. He went to schools that were unaccredited his entire life. They were horribly understaffed with good teachers. Bad teachers who'd been moved from other places were dumped. It was completely segregated. Efforts to use laws to integrate it were beaten back at every opportunity. He was, when he graduated high school, I remember the pictures of him wearing his mortar and saying he was going off to college. He was going to a for-profit college to learn skills that were no longer in use, to come out with more debt than he had going in, which was the case. The federal government eventually shut these for-profit schools down. But where do they pop up? Where do they mushroom? Black communities. Because we're eager to have success and we have no opportunities. They take advantage of financial extraction, constant punishment, and containment, right? He had no opportunities. And it was built into his terrain. If you pull Darren Wilson out, his life would have been wonderful because he would maybe not have ever died. But he might have also died the following week.
Right.
Main point is to not get caught up on that very small lens and understand that for every horrible loss of Michael Brown, are thousands and thousands of others just barely hanging on. And so, that's what I think we want to force the country to deal with, because otherwise we'll never get out of this. We'll never be able to break into the status of equality that we're looking for.
Help me think about the role of capitalism in that. As you talk about Mike Brown, he gets stopped jaywalking.
Mm-hmm. Right, but actually, he gets stopped for walking in the roadway in an inappropriate manner. Yeah.
Right.
He was just walking in the street.
Yes, walking in the street.
Not using the sidewalk, which was extremely narrow, which you could barely do with two people.
Right. It's impossible almost.
That's right.
And Mike was a big boy.
Exactly.
So the question is, why would that be something to stop somebody for? And when you look at Ferguson, you look at Emerson Electric had left, and there's capital flight, so people didn't have jobs. The town didn't have revenue, and giving people these ridiculous tickets was a big way that these town collected revenue. I think 80 at the time he got killed. I wrote it in my book Nobody. I think it was like 80% or 85% of the adult population had warrants. I mean, it was some bizarre number. So policing they turn into tax collectors.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because racism is this thing that he's experiencing, but it seems to be bound up in all the other things. Again, the loss of Emerson Electric to the Far East, the jobs left town. Mm-hmm. The whole globalization is a part of that. You have so all of this is playing into again the privatization of schools. The Normandy School District never got proper funding. Mm-hmm. How does racism get tied up in capitalism, especially at a moment where people, especially academics, are starting to talk about racial capitalism more?
Mm-hmm.
It's not always entirely clear to people what that means.
Yeah.
And if they're separable at all.
Well, I mean, look, there's no question that capitalism is really, comes of age on the backs of Black people from the beginning, right? It's not as if this is a recent phenomenon. And by that, I mean that as a targeted, intentionally, vulnerably positioned group of people, right? That Black people have been made vulnerable and been accessible for extraction of resources, accessible for hyper punishment, profitable for various reasons, and also modes of containment and attaching risk to Black life so that non-risk and opportunity can be attached to white life, pretty much. Mm-hmm. That's been the case for a very long time. Capitalism is profits from that scenario, but it's not the only reason that Black people are in those vulnerable positions. I mean, in other words, it is capitalism benefits and fuels and takes advantage of this. But it's not just about capitalism, it's also about racial hierarchy, even when there's not a profit to be made. So for example, prisons cost, often 4 and 5 times the annual budget of putting a kid in school, right? Putting them in school and paying for school. So if the matter is making money, why would you spend so much money incarcerating people?
Right.
So it's not just that, because when you look at the system overall, there's a value in being able to contain people, extract from people, and to continue a process by which you can punish and manipulate that same group of people at will. That's not just capitalism. That's racist behavior for purposes of not only profit economically but social positioning.
How do you think about those processes mm-hmm. in a country that has a particular type of racial hierarchy? In other words, poor people get exploited, poor people get incarcerated, but Black people are disproportionately those things. Right. Why us?
Yeah, but so there's a question before that I think we both would probably agree on the answer to, but I want to make sure that your community and peoples on your channel come here first before they move to that question. And that is that many people want us to think this is all about class.
Right.
It is just that Black people are disproportionately poor. And if that were not the case, if we had a class revolution, then this would end. And so there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And the reason that's not true is because Black poverty is created. It's not a fact of life. It is created by racism and by classism, right? And so the status of Black people is not something that we can sort of freeze in place and say what makes it work is capitalism. Because first of all, many middle class and upper middle class Blacks face significant modes of economic and social discrimination that has a huge impact. It has nothing to do with being disadvantaged on a class level.
Right, which you talk about in your book, by the way.
Exactly, right. And I also talk about, look, if you can't see how race is functioning within class and outside of the class hierarchy, then you can't understand systemic racism. And part of the problem here is that people don't want to understand systemic racism because it forces a lens on the normalcy of everyday life as a source of significant advantage for whites. It makes them have to imagine that they are, no matter their point of view, no matter their political value, basically are living in a society which they may hate. They may hate this fact, right? That it creates this profound disadvantage versus an advantage, but they still benefit. They get a Trumpite and a Kamala Harris live right next door to each other. They're both going to have the advantages that many African Americans would not have. So it's not about their political values.
No, not at all. So if we say class matters, but that this isn't fundamentally a class-based problem, which is what, in terms of the political arena, that's what Bernie Sanders was arguing. We will invest in the right spaces. We'll hold the rich accountable, and this stuff will resolve itself. If we recognize that that's not it, that there's something else here, how intractable does the problem become? Like, can we fix this, or are we always going to be in a world or a society, at least in the United States context, where there's going to be anti-Black racism and where there's going to be systemic inequality?
I mean, I really hope not. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that a systems approach actually gives us a way out, not just a way underneath the weight of the system. So before I answer that and explain that a little bit more, I think it's really important to realize that, class inequality is pretty intractable too. I mean, I think that somehow racism is just going to be so intractable. We can't, this
but capitalism is in, right?
There's nothing more easy to give up on than fighting racism. Man, we've been doing, who wants to, it ain't going to change. Like as if class has not been the driving factor of the modern West for several hundred years. And in fact, how many Gilded Ages are we going to have?
Right.
You know what I mean? So like that. So, but that somehow seems like it can be fixed in people's minds, even though it has never actually been close to being fixed. But in terms of like why systems approaches are both daunting and incredibly helpful, is because as you know, if we were on a sort of mainstream media show right now and we were looking at the stats of disparity, right? They love the word disparity because it seems very neutral, right? This group of people have this situation, Black people have 1/10 of the wealth that whites do, right? There was the recent stats talking about how the income gap had narrowed by something like, $5. I mean, it was literally something absurd. And in fact, it was unfortunate because white income had gone down and Black income had gone up.
Right.
And so now with all of this systemic evidence showing the exact opposite, they want to do an entire segment on what looks like a white disadvantage, right? That somehow this is creating a system, right? So what happens is we get so caught up in that, we don't really look and see how a cumulative chronic disadvantage across areas in society are creating these kinds of outcomes. It's not one policy. It's not one practice. It's not one bad apple cop. It's not one bad teacher. It's not, it's none of those things. Instead, it's how they work together to create these chronic outcomes. And I think the thing that is most disturbing is that we want to imagine that they're not happening. Hang on. I have to edit this one. Okay. All right. I'm gonna have a cough drop.
No, take your time. I'm going to pause.
One of the reasons why taking a systems approach is so helpful for me is that it allows people to be free of this blame game, right? Are you a racist? Did you do something racist? And we get caught up in this behavioral definition of racism, where we started out and I said, look, there's personal beliefs, personal attitudes, individual or interpersonal behavior, unconscious bias, all of that really ignores the fact that that's not the bulk of where the harm happens. But what it does is it really traps people into feeling guilty and other people feeling angry and intractable. What I love about a systems approach is I teach it and I talk to people and I say, okay, let's solve this problem together. Here's the puzzle, right? Now, whatever you believe and agree, it doesn't matter.
Right.
I'm not going to put you out. You might have ways of helping us solve this problem, right? And so it gives people a little personal distance, but it also eventually creates a sense of like, well, wait a minute, we're all responsible too.
Right.
Right.
Talk to me about the responsibility, though, because many have argued repairing or dismantling, destroying white supremacy is white people's work. Black people suffer, but it's white people's work. In the same way that dismantling patriarchy is men's work. Is in the context of a systems approach, is that still the case?
I mean, it's the work of anybody who wants to take it on, but it is, it is not that. See, that whole idea that white supremacy is white people's work, I don't even understand that answer, because first of all, they're not suffering from it. So if answers that are going to be given are not really to be let in the hands of people who have no analysis of why they're in a supremacist situation. So what we need is people who are aware of these categories, who think through them carefully, and they're more likely to be women in the case of patriarchy. And they're more likely to be Black people in the case of anti-Black racism. They're more likely to be Jewish in the case of anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, they're living the problem and the experience. Why would we negate our role in defining the end of that kind of discrimination and leave it in the hands of other people? I don't really understand that.
So how do we get them to buy in? So we do the labor of showing them the privilege and the power dynamic.
I see the problem.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying, like we do all this work and they just say, oh, that's lovely, thank you, and they go on and do it.
Right. Like,
hey,
damn.
Here's why, because we're not doing the work for them. We're not doing the work for them to ignore. I'm doing the work so Black folk can figure out what they're up against. Because the constant mission to convince us that this is just about hard work, opportunity that we create for ourselves, discipline, genetic intelligence, right? This is a constant message that denies the fact that we're running headlong into a hurricane all the time and thinking that we have the same conditions that everybody else has, because that's what we keep being told.
Right.
And it's not just a lie, it's a profoundly destructive, injuring lie that discourages people profoundly. Now, some people say, I don't want to know about all this depressing information. But for me, it's like, look, this means I know where to fight. I know how to fight better. I know that certain things are going to be places where I really need to be concerned for my kids as opposed to others, because there's interlocking components that I wouldn't otherwise know about and I wouldn't put them together. And so for me, it's like, look, we set the terms for the solution. That's how you build a movement that has the potential to bring along a variety of people, including African Americans, of course, at the base, to transform what's going on. And in a society that's hell-bent on creating ignorance as a strategy for education, right? Literally. Knowing is better than knowing. We have to create our own freedom schools all over again. We have to create our own freedom schools where we're not relying on this kind of technocratic or colorblind, actually, sometimes racist producing curriculum that makes us focus on individual personal identity as opposed to society's organization as a whole. And so to me, that's what it's for. I mean, I didn't write Meta Racism to convince white people that there's racism. I wrote it for everybody who's interested, but I mostly wrote it to say, look, everybody keeps telling you since, the beginning of Black Lives Matter that this thing called systemic racism is a fiction. And it's been used very loosely, right? It's been system, it's been structure, it's been, institution. And it's not been clear what people mean all the time. And that lack of clarity has worked to produce a general rejection, right? Well, what are you talking? It's everywhere. And so what do? They import the notion that everyone is personally, individually racist. You see, they take it into personal behavior and import it into a system framework to say, you're making the case, Tricia, or whoever, that everybody's personally racist. But no, I'm not saying that at all. You're using the wrong definition of racism. And then I said, right, that's what helps us get going and like, okay, so there's something different that needs to be addressed.
One of the things that got really spicy among academics and some other people, because the book did really well, was when Ibram Kendi wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things he raised as an idea was that Black folk can be racist too. Ibram's a friend. I've told him before. I'll tell him again when he comes on the show in a couple of weeks. He dead wrong on that. I just don't see. I understand the point he's making. I'm not sure if the language in the framework of racism is the appropriate thing to make the argument that he's making. But from your framework of meta racism, let me start by asking: are white people victims of racism? And I don't mean in their souls are tied. I mean, like, are they systemically harmed by racism?
No, because the data shows that, and there's really no data that says that whites are at a disadvantage under any general major conditions that I looked at. So I studied about 100 policies across the 4 or 5 areas of life that I think are most important: housing, education, criminal justice, and I always forget the fourth: wealth and income and resources. And when you look at all of those factors, what kind of housing circumstances, what kind of neighborhoods, what kinds of assets accrue value versus reduce in value, and what are the policies that connect with each other to create this crisis. So, for example, in the homeless crisis for Black men in particular is extremely high. Black men are something like almost 50% of the homeless population, but they are only 6% of the population in the country. Okay, now why? Well, you got mass incarceration. Well, but why? Not just, hey, it's hard to get a job when you come out of prison, but even more importantly, you cannot live with relatives who are in any kind of subsidized housing.
Right.
So add a condition to a situation that has no reason to be there except to continue to punish, right, and to exclude and marginalize them from their families. So you can't support your son or your niece or your uncle or your brother or sister by giving them a place to stay while they catch up and try to find a job, because they'll be losing their subsidized housing. And then you basically create more fragility in the community. You destroy the bonds of community and family that could, in fact, help blunt the force of this, experience of deep, alienation and suffering that prison causes everybody. So now you see, well, this they have to be homeless. They have nowhere to go. They can't afford anything. They come out of jail with $50, $10, $1. So, if you don't put those pieces together and say, well, wait, this whole logic of adding to the post-mass incarceration rules that they cannot live or even stay for any length of time in family members' subsidized or public housing is unnecessary. But unless you're trying to completely destroy and disassemble, right, and make sure that this community is not able to gather itself and be on parity with everybody else. But you wouldn't see it because that's not the headline in the policy, right? It's not the headline.
I'm glad you said policy, because before we go, I want to ask you about policy. We're going into an election. See, I'm not going to ask you what you would tell Donald Trump, because I ain't gonna waste your time or mine. But if Kamala Harris wins this race, and as I've said many times, even to make people mad, she's not a radical. A case can be made she's not a progressive, right? But she's a moderate, she's a liberal. So she's going to be pulled towards some of these policy decisions, right? They're not going to be just baked into her.
No, they won't. That's right.
What policies do we need to push back against and ultimately dismantle systemic racism?
Wow, man, there's so many places we could go. Well, let me say, first of all, that I think it's completely unreasonable to expect us to elect a radical left-wing candidate.
Right.
Well, I mean, I hate to use, I hate to be practical. I'm just too practical.
I'm there too now. You know, I feel you.
I'm not saying it wouldn't be wonderful in many ways, but it is not happening.
Right.
Okay, not now. So let's just do when we know. If you know what the assignment is they do the assignment. Let's not complain about the thing that's 20,000 times better than the thing we might have,
Right.
and then be mad that we're giving in. Giving in to what?
Right.
I mean, I'm just like, look, don't bring me that. It's just irrational behavior. We're never voting for the individual candidate, really. We're voting for a set of ideas that drive the party that we're talking about. Okay, and we know what Project 2025 looks like. And we know what Donald Trump has said he's going to do. He wants to end democracy, end voting, end participation, end the entire structure to create a world in which people have equal access, including women, and control of their reproductive freedoms. I mean, to me, there's no debate or discussion about that. To me, I'm not waiting for Bernie Sanders' offspring to, populate the next election. Let's just get through this one. But on the question of what we could do, I mean, any one of the areas I mentioned would be amazing, but I think the best thing we could do that would probably be both the hardest and also the hardest to resist is a true equal educational opportunity.
That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you don't have any moral grounds to say, well, he was a criminal, fool sold drugs. This is like a 6-year-old who's starving to death, going to a bad school, has, you just consign him or her to absurd conditions for life. How do you explain that as reasonable?
Right. It's indefensible.
Right. So it feels, but it's also the hardest because those school board meetings are vicious. You talk about it in your book. I mean, it's vicious.
Yeah.
Protectionist behavior is very intense.
But targeting, but I like the idea of, again, targeting public policies and saying, hey, we can do something about this. This is a fixable problem.
Yep.
And that's why I really appreciated, and y'all need to actually go out and read Meta Racism, because it helps us, again, move past the conspiracy theories, the idea that there's just some dudes in the back twirling their mustaches, hatching plans out, the idea that you just got bad luck or you're lazy or that it's a cultural deprivation that's making this happen, that it's our fault internally or so. There are systemic reasons that get us here. But like you said, that also gives us a hope that they're fixable. Systems created them so systems can end them.
That's right. That's right. Because the same thing that creates what we call compounded negative situation, like I said about the homeless crisis, right? That's also the place that can become a leverage point of opportunity. So if you find the leverage points that have created the greatest harm in your community, it could be any number of things. If you can reverse that by targeting those connections and severing the negative connections, that is to say, fighting that public housing should be available to people who are formerly incarcerated and family members should not be punished for that, could have reduced the homeless crisis by significant margin in the Black community, fairly immediately. The hospitals should be of equal quality. There's no grounds for this.
Right, none.
We live in it like it's completely reasonable. So I think seeing where the joints are, it's almost like, finding the joints where things are really in motion. And, that is very empowering and can be activated by community members because they know how these connections are really being experienced on the ground.
And that is why, y'all, to be clear, to tie it full circle, the question of, is Kamala Harris Black? Is she Black enough? Is she really Black?
Don't get caught up.
Don't waste your time. It is a distraction. There are real, fundamental, substantive questions that need to be raised. If we want to talk about race and Blackness and harm and inequality, talk about the systemic stuff. Talk about the structural stuff. Talk about meta racism. The book is called Meta Racism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. It's written by the brilliant, as always, Tricia Rose. Tricia, thank you for doing this with us.
Oh, man, this was my pleasure, Mark. This is a great thing you do out here. I really appreciate you, and thanks for having me on anytime.
For sure. We'll talk again soon. Everybody, that was the show. Again, the book is called Meta Racism. Please, y'all, make sure that you check it out. How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. It's a wonderful book. It's smart, it's subtle, it's nuanced, and it's also accessible. It's what Tricia Rose is. It's who Tricia Rose has been her entire career. Make sure y'all check that out. And thank you all for watching Office Hours. I know I done hit some buttons wrong. It should be saying Office Hours all on the screen. My producer is going to cuss me out for doing this wrong. but I promise you I did the best I could. The point is we got the content. The videos don't look right, but the content, you know what? Here it is. Office, yeah, that was supposed to be up the whole time, y'all. Don't get mad at me, Princess. But make sure y'all watch Office Hours every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you're so inclined, make sure you hit that join button. When you hit the join button, you become a monthly subscriber to the channel and a monthly member of the channel, which gives us the financial support we need to do the work that we do. And finally, if you can't make a monthly commitment, consider jumping on it through Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle, and making a one-time, not one time, but 1 month donation, what we call tuition, to Night School and to the Office Hours. It allows us to do the work we do. There's no corporate money behind us. There's no billionaire here. There is no a mainstream media outlet underwriting us. This is powered by the people. So please do what you can. But the most important thing is not the money. The most important thing is that you watch, that you share, and of course, that you study, because that's what Night School and Office Hours